And it is, no more nor less than military medical fetishism taken up to 11. And I'm also thinking of when those first critical hits tables for Dungeons and Dragons came in. I used to think they came in with the Arduin Grimoire, but I'm not sure if that's true. I think it was actually one of the TSR little pamphlet supplements sometime in the mid 70s that I read, that the phrase breasts slash genitals torn off has sadly have been unable to forget that. So that little table, somebody can remind me or can cite, okay, that's in here. The first AD&D, or not AD, the first D&D criticals supplemental that was made available in text. And so I think that's a completely different pedigree from the RuneQuest one. Morrow Project / that Dungeons and Dragons table, which, if I'm not mistaken, did not make it into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So maybe that's where this next part of the question comes from, which is, how did this get into Dungeons and Dragons? And I'm like, well, there was one in the early days, but I don't think it got into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm pretty sure it never got into the Holmes Moldvay Menser sequence. Which brings us to another very interesting point. So looking at the array of games. Oh, wait, let's not forget Melee and Wizard, of course, where you're rolling 3d6 and you have a target number. You want to get that number or below. Well, if you roll on 3d6, a 3, triple damage, a 4, double damage, a 5, automatic hit. Well, the others are automatic hits too. And then the same thing for the fumbles. I think it was 16 automatic miss, 17 dropped weapon, 18 broken weapon. So those were built into the tail ends of that rather strong bell curve of the 3d6 roll. And in Melee and Wizard, that roll does not interact with another roll like it does in RuneQuest. So those are just raw percentages from that bell. So with that, we have these three factors coming in. Okay, so those are our three factors. We've got these clinical lists of critical nastinesses that can occur, each associated with a small percentage from Morrow Project and adjacent things. And then we've also got that similar D&D table, which is a single table of all these awful things that can happen to you. And I can't remember. I mean, you were trying to roll high back then, and so I guess if you rolled a natural 20, then you went and rolled on this table. That's what I think was the case. And then you have that business with the GURPS thing, and then you have the BRP thing. Okay, so those are three different basic trajectories. I'm folding AD&D or folding D&D in with the early D&D in with the Morrow Project type thing. If we go to Rollmaster, it's clearly associated with one of those, which is the Morrow Project early D&D method. Basically, you have a single percentage roll. You roll, you hit a certain sector of it, and then you go and you roll over on the critical table and see what you get there. I could be stating that a little differently. Maybe there's some bleed over, like the higher you roll, then the more further up you go on the next table or something like that. It's been a while. But the whole point is that table is one of those lists that looks a lot like what I just described. So the whole Rollmaster thing, I think, isn't an extension of the BRP thing. I think it has a different root. So again, flashing back to me, approximately age 20, not something that I necessarily want to do emotionally, we end up looking at a few other interesting phenomena, particularly the role of champions and a number of related systems, and D&D as such at the time, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, or for others, Moldvay, and / early Menser, which I didn't have much contact with at that moment. But what we encountered was this. In Champions, which had a similar 3d6 roll to Melee, etc., they didn't have increased or decreased effects or negative effects at the extreme misses or at the extreme excess results, at the extreme hits. 3 on 3d6 was an automatic success. 18 on 3d6 is an automatic failure. But that's it. There were no other content-based consequences of, hitting those far ends of the rolled spectrum. And yet we did them anyway. Usually in terms of opportunities for colorful narration. So someone would shout fumble upon rolling an 18. Even though fumbling was not in the rules, there is no fumble table, there is no designation of an 18 as being a narratively special moment. It's just an automatic miss. So we did it anyway. And I know that this happened in Dungeons and Dragons as well, when we were playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons before the DM guide and after the player's handbook. So who knows? Maybe there's a whole thing in the DM guide about this that I've completely forgotten about. But the point is that in the in that stage of play, we insisted that rolling a 20 would do a thing. And people often talk about it. Remember, because you had a D20 and it was numbered 1 through 0 twice. So it wasn't numbered 1 through 20. And you roll a D6 along with it for high or low, whether it's odds or evens or 1 through 3 or something. But, the D6 tells you whether it's in the single digits or whether it's in the teens. And so you roll them together and that's how you get your 1 through 20. And so therefore getting a 6 and a 0, even though a 6 wasn't like supposed to be different. I mean, the D20 is the D6 is supposed to be just a 50-50, but hey, a 6 is like the biggest number on there. And you rolled this natural 20 and people retain that by, when you get like a D20 invented later and people actually rolled it and the 20 came up, they said, natural 20. This lasted. I mean, this became embedded in the culture of playing D&D, so that whatever extent that anything existed in the rules of all the various different forms through the 80s, of which, Sean, you are far more encyclopedic and detailed in terms of detail, in terms of which rule does what than I am. Suffice to say, there's a lot. I mean, especially in the run-up to second edition through the 80s as well. So both trajectories of D&D have like all these multiple little steps and options everywhere. So you just take your encyclopedic knowledge of that and see if what I'm saying is making sense. That no matter what any one of those said or recommended or provided as an option, people at the tables were doing what I was talking about. You roll a 1, shit, something bad happens. Roll the natural 20, either the old school way with your 2 dice or your new school way with a freaking die that goes from 1 to 20. Who knew? But you get that, and, in my experience, it was usually double damage. And I suspect this fell into a whole bunch of other games as well. If a game didn't have the far end of the spectrum designated as such things, people did it anyway. It was part of role-playing. So that sort of brings me up to halfway through your paragraph. And so then it says these ideas did bleed through into 90s and early 2000s, where it has created the idea of extra in skill and attribute checks, where a critical skill check provides some added benefit. Okay, well, you can see where I'm quibbling. It wasn't created then. It was merely enshrined in text in terms of what people were doing, particularly with Dungeons and Dragons. So if you were to, when you look at the Wizards of the Coast version, the original one and beyond, you're going to find that stuff in there. And actually, a lot of it looks a little more RuneQuesty, not in terms of resolution, because you're still just rolling against a target, not against another roll, but in terms of the effect, like, what is it? You full damage. You can do this much full damage. Let's back up a little bit. Why would people do this, particularly for Dungeons and Dragons? Well, one of the issues here is that a hit often didn't do very much. And especially since you had a damage roll and you went through all this effort, and 1 out of 3 times you're actually managing to land a hit on this son of a bitch. And then when you do, and you roll a 1 on your d10 for damage, you're kind of like, how much more of this crap do I have to do? So the idea, first of all, of getting a magic weapon, which is going to do something heinous to them, no matter what you roll when you hit, is very important. Even just a +2 or +3 on your damage roll is very important, because you're never going to get that dreadful 1 result on your damage roll, which is basically just another miss. But especially if the weapon does something terrible as well, then you're cooking with gas. Now you're getting in there and you can roll a hit, because when you hit, a thing will happen. So the critical is a way for that to get folded into play in general, that you can actually manage to get some heinous damage done, which is kind of what you wanted to do. It's kind of a compensation for the damage rolls not being all that, impactful. So I can very much see how that got embedded at the tables, and in my opinion, a rather mathematically, understandable way. So that's where I think then the WotC designs just said, what are people doing? Because if there's one thing that 3rd edition did in design, was spend a decade informally before they knew they were going to have to do it, and formally afterward, when they said, what are people actually doing at the tables? Let's just make a lot of that the rules. And that's why I think you see it more explicitly in those versions of D&D, not because it got embedded there and then created that aspect of play. I think that aspect of play was extremely well entrenched. So then, my experience with more recent designs shows the implementation of the critical largely absent. Okay. That is kind of true, I guess, although the range of modern game design is very difficult to really summarize, and I actually would suggest that in something like Apocalypse World, that criticals are very much present. And I'm also looking at my designs, which are not intended to be representative, not by a long shot. But if we look at those, you'll find that there is no such thing. Why? Because the nature of my resolutions give a wide range of results. Looking at, for example, Circle of Hands, which is a good reference because I retained a great deal of older design features in there, so it doesn't step very far away from some of the more familiar games. I effectively said that when you get a big difference between the attack roll and the defense roll, and that difference is the metric that you carry forward to do something with, not very unusual design-wise, that when that difference is huge, that is your critical. There you go. There's your critical. Because the damage ranges up into that level of crippling and maiming and killing on a single blow, okay, it can do that statistically, so that small percentage range where those things can happen, that's your critical. You've already got your critical in the damage mechanisms. So if you already have the effects that we're looking for, which is the capacity for not knowing when, but knowing that sometimes when you hit, a big splash will occur. If that's baked into the resolution system already, you don't need a subroutine. I think that actually goes back to Cyberpunk. If I look back on the games that actually manage that particularly well, now it's not in Champions, because in Champions you're rolling huge handfuls of dice, and so you end up with an incredibly strong, swing to the mode, the middle value, in terms of how much damage you do. It's just swingy enough, I think, to be useful in play, but very, very little, very minimally so. If we look at Cyberpunk, I think that's where you can see that the damage roll for example, a bullet, makes all the difference. And I do it also has that difference in attack and defense too that gets folded in. So that's where you get the idea of, okay, a big difference in the attack and damage and a big difference in the direct damage metric, and you can blow a guy's head off. Okay, you know what? If that's in the range of what can occur on a bullet hitting, depending on how well you hit and that kind of thing, then there's your critical. So I think that's kind of where that came in my experience. It may be in some older designs, maybe not. Perhaps, in a lot of cases, it had to do with your weapon, right? Going all the way back to melee, that battle axe with 3d6 damage is like, holy crap. But I think Cyberpunk is where I really found it, very carefully understood that you don't need extra rules for, the excellence of a hit. It's part of what we're doing here. Okay, so those are some of my thoughts on criticals, but to follow through with everything you wrote, in your experience, was the cult of the critical a large part of play? Well, yes, I'm not sure I call it a cult, but I think it's rather rational in many cases. Sometimes not necessary, but it became habitual. It became an understanding of how to play for a lot of people. Almost everybody I ever played with, in fact. Was the idea of a critical success something you considered in your designs or gave very little thought to? Well, it is something I considered in my designs, because that wide range of potential effect is something that I quite value, especially at the high end. Meaning very little effect at the low end is something that I don't like particularly, but I thought a lot about, if we're going to go to all the trouble to be resolving anything, then the nature of resolution itself, at its basic level of the actual routines that you use by default, those should yield critical results sometimes for those games. So yes, I did consider it and gave a lot of thought to it, and then didn't have a designated subroutine because I made sure, based on experience with other games, that you didn't have to.